Welcome to Café with Cavanha. It's a pleasure to have today Ceveland Jones with us in PUC Rio, researcher at National Institute of Oil and Gas at the State University of Rio de Janeiro, Geosciences and Geopolitics consultant, Physicist and Economist, Cornell University, post-graduation in Petroleum Engineering, master's and doctorate degree from Geology Department at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. We invited him to talk about expected hydrocarbon volumes at pre-salt fields in Brazil. Good afternoon, Professor Ceveland.
Good afternoon, Cavanha. Very good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you. Could you please tell us the studies and research you know about pre-salt, expected values in pre-salt?
Well, we know that there have been various institutions that have conducted assessments of the volumes of recoverable resources in the pre-salt and in other basins in Brazil as well. Among those are the USGS, which has conducted surveys of all countries around the world, especially the main petroleum basins. Of course, we have at the university, Professor Hernani, Chaves, and I, also the EPE in Brazil as a planning entity. They conduct their own assessments. And of course, companies do, but the companies, we don't have access to what their assessments are. Naturally, they are proprietary. But we do have some access to some of these other assessments.
And so companies, you mean Petrobras and other major companies that they do that?
Yeah, Petrobras we know has, including with the kinds of tools that we use as well. So in order to do these assessments, of course, you use software tools and so on. The methodologies are slightly different. And of course, the way that each one does the assessment is also a little bit different. So we can't really compare apples to apples, but we get close. And indeed, we know that Exxon and some other majors have also done assessments of these areas. In fact, they have to, because they are bidding on some of these areas. They have to know more or less what's going on.
Yeah. And which methodologies are used in these situations?
Okay, in practice, it's very simple, but the concept, but in practice, it's complicated, because what we use, unlike some of Petrobras, for example, they have information that we don't. We use only publicly available information. And you have to actually mine that information on the internet and all the reports and then the releases and so on. So the first step is a really thorough fact-finding survey of the information that pertains to the fields in the areas that you are assessing. That is really very difficult because, especially in the pre-salt, ever since it was discovered, for example, there was a lot of information released piecemeal, a little bit here, then about Lula, and then about Yara, but it's difficult to have a comprehensive database which would help so much. But that is the work that's involved. And then you gather all of this information so that you have enough data for your assessment to be statistically significant and to have good results.
It means that the information, the results you have are possible and probable values. Which value?
Exactly. It's all a probabilistic assessment. So just like in Norway, the NPD, the directorate there actually requires the companies operating there to release information about resources and reserves and so on a probabilistic basis, meaning that you don't give one number, but you give a range of what your expected values are. This is a much more true indication of what your expectations are, because there's a great deal of uncertainty in any of these basins that you assess. In our case, for example, for the pre-salt, there was a lot of uncertainty right at the beginning because there wasn't enough drilling and results available. As time goes on, you gather more information because there is more drilling conducted, more results provided, discoveries made, even some dry holes. All of that is very important because the methodology, in fact, relies on creating a field-sized distribution curve of the accumulations that exist in each area. With that, you more or less know how many small, medium, and large fields are distributed. Then you look at the discovery sequence, meaning which discoveries came when, what year you had discoveries. It is expected that the bigger ones would normally come at the beginning because, of course, you focus on the big things, and even statistically, if you have big and small, even randomly, you're likely to pick a big one. So, but that's expected. But even so, there is a trend in the discoveries that creates a discovery sequence. And that is very important because what we do is we actually mix those two and apply that with some other parameters that limit things in the assessment model. And then we can recreate a reality that exists in the field in a statistical model that we can then process with software tools. Basically, we use a lot of software modeling involving Monte Carlo simulations, stochastic assessments of each of those possible accumulations. Then we aggregate them. The mechanics may be a little complicated, but that's what the software tools do for you.
And which numbers you have reached and volumes, barrels?
Well, right at the beginning, our first assessment, I think 2011, was based on less information than we have now. So naturally, our numbers were very wide. We came up with something like 120 billion barrels to 200 or almost 320 billion barrels. Very wide discrepancy between what we think is the least number of resources. Even so, 120 billion, 320 billion barrels recoverable resources is very large. And in fact, at that time, no one was mentioning those numbers. I know that people at the ministry and at A&P would mention, we have here maybe 20 billion and this, but no one dared to talk about 100 billion. They were all embarrassed to throw those numbers out. So then in 2014-15, we did a reassessment. We called it a reassessment because we basically went through all of that database plus all of the new information that became available with it.
And revised the studies.
And revised using basically the same methodology, very carefully looking at it, sometimes reevaluating the information that we had. Some fields were moved up, some down after the discoveries. But with all of that information, we put all of that in, and we came up with results that basically narrowed the extremes. That tells us very good things, that our methodology is robust and that it is very, we have high confidence in it. And in fact, the lower number, which corresponds to 90% confidence level that the resources that are recoverable are at least 176 billion barrels. Now we're up to 100
times the proved reserves.
So I mean, even those numbers are almost too big to talk about, and the higher number, with only 10% chance that the actual resources that are recoverable would be higher than that, was 273 billion barrels. So now we're talking the range of Saudi Arabia, of course Venezuela, which is all fake because that oil is not recoverable, but now we're in the range of the big fields.
Top five.
Certainly, top three.
Top three.
Yeah. Even in 2015, it was very difficult to convince reporters from the United States and so on, but we did have people come to visit us and to interview us about the studies, because some people picked up on that and they said, really, how could you come up with those numbers? And we showed them the methodology, and we very much wanted to show that these are numbers that are reliable. These are numbers that were conducted, the results were obtained with methodologies that turned out to be robust, and we showed that because from each assessment, the numbers are actually getting narrower. In fact, when the oil prices really came down very low, and some analysts everywhere, including in Brazil, were saying, oh, well, it's too bad. Now the pre-salt is just not economically viable. You know, all your 100+ billion barrels went down the drain. And we said, wait a second, let's do another assessment. Let's do an assessment considering what we call lower for longer. Lower prices, say, in the $40, $50 range out into the future. Of course, nowadays, those numbers are still low, but it shows that the results that we obtained with those numbers are very reliable in terms of what is viable now, because, of course, we have higher prices than that, and indeed, the costs of exploration even came down. And what we came up with is that considering lower oil prices, which in turn translates into only seeking the best fields, you know, you're not going to try to develop the fields that are maybe marginal, the results only came down 10 to 15%. So now instead of 170, we're talking 140 or 50, and the top numbers into the 240 or 250 billion barrels. You know, it didn't change much, and this should have put to rest the discussion about, oh, this is viable or this is not viable. Definitely. And in fact, I think it's just turned out to be the opposite. The news has just shown us that the pre-salt has shown itself to be more competitive with time.
Cleveland, what does it mean for the upcoming bid rounds in Brazil that we have for the next years? You mean these results can, let's say, bring more people to Brazil or bring the vision to Brazil?
Yes, I think it can. Unfortunately, these bid rounds, at least for the pre-salt and even the 16th round that we had, are really for the big boys, and that means that these majors that are participating in these rounds, they probably are not the ones that need to be convinced of our results. They probably accept them.
They just are here.
Yeah, they're here. They're working with some of these fields, even if they're not operating. They have traction here, so they are not taken aback when we say 170 billion. They will say, well, maybe we check here and there, but they don't doubt those numbers. The problem is that there are a lot of other companies that are still not here, and maybe even big companies that don't have the experience to put them in touch with the kinds of results we have here. Those companies, for example, might have heard, but maybe don't give enough attention to the fact that we have wells that are producing 50,000 barrels a day. I mean, this is unheard of. This is in the top 100,000th of the number of wells in the world. So we're talking 1,000th of 1%, you know, are wells that have this kind of productivity. And if you talk all of the wells, we're down to 15, 17,000 barrels per well, still way beyond anything that is common anywhere else. So there's no question that the companies that are here are aware of that. Maybe this information is slowly making itself available to companies elsewhere, and in fact we're seeing more new companies coming in, and I think that over time this has changed the profile of the companies coming in, companies that wouldn't have looked at Brazil before.
More the independent companies, medium-sized ones?
I think so. You know, the Exxon, Shell, BPs and so on, there's no question. This is the only game in the world for them to be involved with if they wish to put a large chunk of base production into their portfolio. They can't do this in West Africa, even in the Gulf of Mexico. They can't do it at this scale. They can't do it in Asia. In the Middle East, it's just impossible now. In the Mediterranean, what was there is basically a different kind of play. So there's no question, yeah, the very big players have to be here. There's no question that they will be here, but we still need to attract, as you say, the medium and even smaller companies that can take a small piece in one of these blocks.
When you mention these restrictions or the division is not completely done, is based on regulatory problems, legal problems, contracts instability? And what we need to do, we must do to make more attractive our fields?
I don't think that we have those barriers necessarily. I think that we do have very stable regulatory environment. We've shown that in practice. And it survived a lot of changes in the past that maybe led some people to think, oh, what's going to happen? And it turns out that nothing happened, and that's good. And in fact, I think that if nothing happens again is better, rather than trying to fix what's already working. So if we leave well enough alone, it will be well. And I think companies expect that. They've shown that. The past 16th bidding round has shown that the companies are very willing. There's no lack of capital to bring in for good plays. They're not going to come in for everything, but talking about pre-salt and just around the pre-salt, definitely. We also did a similar yet-to-find assessment of resources that could be recoverable in the Campos Basin, in shallow waters, and that is also 10 to 17 billion barrels. Not so big, but for a different type of company, that could be attractive. But as long as you have the pre-salt, which is all big stuff, of course, that is on the back burner, and it doesn't attract the attention that the big blocks do. And the blocks that we're talking about in the pre-salt and just around the pre-salt, those are the blocks that can attract 2, 3, 4 billion reais or over $1 billion in bonus, and they will continue to do so. But it doesn't mean that all of them will be attractive. In fact, the assessment that we did showed that there are a lot of smaller fields. They will be competitive and they will be commercial, maybe not this decade, but towards the end of the 2020s. So we don't necessarily have to look for fields that are under 1 billion barrels now, but in 5 or 10 years, maybe those fields will be attractive. We will have a lot of infrastructure. So we're looking at the ultimate recoverable resource base of the pre-salt, and that is tremendous because we're basically, the limit that we used in the low price assessment was something like 100 million barrels of recoverable resources. That is a lot, but with infrastructure in place, it's entirely commercial.
Can we attach your white paper in the LinkedIn post to?
Yes, I will send you some of these studies that you can link to. And right now we have some for Sergipe-Alagoas, for example, which is a totally different play. The area we did is also in shallow water and onshore, but it also shows there's potential in undiscovered resource base there. Obviously smaller, a different kind of attraction for different profile company. Also the Campos Basin shallow waters, and of course the pre-salt. And this is, I think, must read. Even if companies have their own assessment and their own tools, they have to do this. In fact, I did this with the USGS assessments, and their assessment is very well regarded, first of all, because it's the USGS, and they did an assessment for the Middle East, for resources that are still to be discovered, all of North America, South America and Caribbean, and no surprise, South America and Caribbean is by far the largest undiscovered resource base around, and the pre-salt is the largest part of that. So we are basically on the right track. We might have differences in methodologies and areas and how we go about it, but it is very good to see that some other studies basically corroborate some of the results that we have provided.
We appreciate this conversation with Professor Ceveland Jones. Thank you very much, and please feel free to make your final comments.
Yes, I think that we are in a very favorable opportunity time frame. Naturally, we will have 2 fantastic rounds coming up. The TOR, the transfer of rights, the Sessão Onerosa bidding round, had some people scared, and I personally spoke with some people that operate in the Gulf of Mexico, and they refused to believe what the round was about. You can't argue facts. I mean, this round is resources that are already discovered. We're not putting on the block resources that may be there. This type of resource base is not available anywhere else, which is the reason why we have 100 billion reais or $25 billion in bonus requirements, but entirely reasonable based on the resources that are in 4 or 5 of those fields, and we assessed each of them basically very close to what the ANP is suggesting that they have, so we feel very comfortable there. And in fact, the people who would bid on those blocks would have the same type of positive outlook based on more than one assessment that they have seen.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.